Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this debrief. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this debrief about the trial of Paul Rusesabagina. Just as a matter of housekeeping, we'll hear from Paul's daughters, Anais and Karine. Then we'll hear from Professor Brian Endless and Peter Coharis, one of Paul's attorneys. And then we will open it up for questions. If you have questions, you can put a question in the Q&A at any time. The Q&A function is down at the bottom of your screen, next to the raise hand button and the chat button. But please put your questions in the Q&A and we will handle them from there. Right now, I'd like to turn it over to Anais Kanimba, who is going to start us off this morning.
Thank you very much, Kitty. Welcome, everyone. Before we start, we'd like to take a moment of silence for Kizito Muhigo. Today is the one-year commemoration of Kizito Muhigo's death. He's a dove of Rwanda. He's a dissident of President Kagame who was killed because of a song, because he spoke the truth and he spoke for the Rwandan people. Today, that was his first year commemoration, and my father's trial was put it instead. And so we want to make sure and remember that, what we're doing today is not just for that, but for all Rwandans who've lost their lives, but for all the Rwandans who are struggling in this country today. So let's start with this moment of silence for Kizito Muhigo first. Thank you. And before I continue a little bit more, my sister would like to tell you about somebody else. Her name is Yvonne.
As Anais clearly put it, there have been so many victims of this government thus far, as she said, Kizito Mihigo, whose death we are honoring today. But just recently as well, another young, brave woman called Yvonne Idamanye was arrested, brutally arrested, and locked up because she dared to speak up, because she dared to speak the truth, and ask for the Rwandan government to stop its habit of hurting the Rwandan people and anyone around the world. And so we just have to remember that this is a struggle that involves so many Rwandans across the world and so many people that have fallen victim of this government. And we hope and pray for her that she remains strong as she is facing this sham justice.
Thank you. Kitty?
Brian, do you want to go ahead and start talking about the trial and what happened last night?
I will. Thank you all very much. And thanks to everyone for joining us on the webinar. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Rusesabagina family and all of us working with Team Rusesabagina. It has been 174 days, almost 5 months, since Paul was kidnapped from Dubai and brought to Rwanda. The headline of today's trial is a quote from Paul, I think. "I was not extradited to Rwanda, I was kidnapped." The trial went on in Kigali earlier today, local time in the US. It ended at 4 or 5 in the morning, depending on where you were in the country. We were watching the trial last night live, and we were both pleased and appalled, but not surprised to see Paul's theater trial begin yesterday. The physical dynamics, the visual dynamics told the story from the start. There were 20 defendants all lined up in rows. There were no desks. There was no place for the defendants to prepare. They had a small stack of papers on their laps, a small folder. It was like they were in a college lecture hall, but they weren't able to bring any materials with them. And these are defendants who are on trial for their lives and possibly life imprisonment. Most importantly, there were no lawyers next to them to assist in their defense. Their lawyers were kept in the back of the room. And just the physical dynamics of that were kind of incredible to see. There was actually a row of cameras and photographers between the accused and the lawyers in the room. As one of our lawyers who was watching with us last night said, that tells you everything you need to know about this show trial, just seeing those pictures. In addition, they pulled kind of a classic thing that you'd expect to see in a bad TV show or movie. At the beginning, as the prosecutors just barely started to describe their case, one of the victims, alleged victims, was brought up, and she had a crying baby with her. And all they were doing was introducing her. Again, this was clearly for show. Victims in a Rwandan trial, as in most places, appear either as witnesses or they appear during the sentencing phase to tell the court how hard this was on them. Bringing up a crying baby at the beginning of the trial is just a horrible farce. As we expected, this is clearly a show trial, a piece of theater by the Rwandan government. Since the trial was in Kenya, Rwanda, and we know many of you were probably not able to get immediate translations. We'd like to highlight just a few of the things that went on and talk about where we expect this could go in the near future. Again, I'll start with a statement from Paul Rusesabagina's opening comments, and this kind of set the tone from our perspective. Paul said, "When I wanted to come to Rwanda in 2003, I came as a Belgian, and I was received as a Belgian. It is only today that I'm here illegally because I was kidnapped and I did not come by my passport. I never regained the Rwandan nationality because I never claimed it back." That was Paul's opening. Paul is simply focused on the fact that he's there illegally. There should be no trial. Our Rwandan lawyer, Gatera Gashabana, began by bringing up the pretrial motions that we have filed over the past month and a half. We have 2 pretrial motions and a pretrial letter into the judge, and we have asked multiple times that these be dealt with before the trial. The government has now chosen to start the trial, but we are dealing with those motions as they come up. We dealt with one of the 5 key issues in those outstanding motions yesterday, or at least started to deal with it. And that was the irregularities in Paul's arrest and in his detention. Paul was kidnapped. He was held incommunicado. We have not yet talked about the circumstances in which he was held. We're still focusing on how Paul got to Rwanda. That's the first issue there. What Gatera brought up is that the irregularities so far are not violations of international law, but are violations of Rwandan law. There was no arrest warrant. We have never seen an arrest warrant. It has not been produced in the documents. And without an arrest warrant, someone should not be arrested inside of Rwanda. And then we began last night to get into the kidnapping and into the questions of how Paul Rusesabagina came to Rwanda, which is really the central point of this trial. Paul did not come of his own free will. That is thus illegal to try him both under Rwandan law, under international law, and frankly, the Belgians and the United States also have laws that deal with these issues. That's the only thing that came out last night. We have 4 more issues. I'm going to talk about them very briefly, and we'll bring these up later as the trial continues. Right now, the trial date has been set for a judgment on the current motion, which is to, stop the trial right now based on the fact that these irregularities exist and that Paul was not arrested legally. The judges will come back in 1 week on February 26th to rule on that. We don't expect them to rule in our favor. Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? Absolutely not, because we think this trial has been preordained. That being said, we still have multiple additional issues. Paul's treatment at the beginning of the trial is something that was in our motions. We believe specifically the Nelson Mandela rules on the treatment of prisoners were not followed in this case, and he was not treated appropriately under international law and under Rwandan law. We need to talk about the denial of his right of adequate time to prepare and resources to prepare for his defense. There are 5,000 plus documents in this indictment. The cases have been joined. Paul is now joined to 20 other, or to 19 rather, other indicted people. And Paul has access to none of these documents. They have been confiscated by the prison. Every time Paul's lawyer provides him with documents, they are confiscated by the prison. He also has limited access to his lawyer. His lawyer still has only been able to visit him 8 times now, and they are not able to talk on the phone because there is no confidential phone contact. Paul is not even given access to a phone to talk to his lawyer. In addition, he's being denied the rights of legal assistance of his choosing. His international lawyers were denied. The government, Rwandan government, is in violation of his right to adequate medical treatment. And there have been a number of other violations of recognized standards that we want to bring up before this trial really starts. The key for last night, as our lawyer Rusesabagina mentioned, was Rwandan prosecution has not presented warrants for the arrest of Paul Rusesabagina. Excuse me. He was neither extradited nor arrested in Kigali, as the prosecution said. He was kidnapped, plain and simple. He could have been extradited. He was kidnapped. There are plenty of precedents in Rwanda for extraditing people from both the United States and from Belgium. I'll close very briefly by talking about what the prosecutor said last night. They began by admitting that they didn't do the indictment very well. Rusesabagina was poking holes in the indictment, and they said that the indictment is not what they meant it said, that parts of the indictment that Gutera was talking about didn't mean what they said in black and white. One of our lawyers argued that this is how you litigate when you don't have the law or the facts on your side. The Rwandans continued to insist that there was an international arrest warrant. United Arab Emirates has denied that in writing to the United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights. They insist that Belgium was involved. Belgium has also denied that along the way. The prosecutors have shown absolutely nothing so far except disdain for their own laws. And I'd like to bring you back again to the central point. As we expected all along, the pre-trial has shown this, and now that the trial has started, it's clear. This is a show trial. It's a piece of theater put together by the Rwandan government for both their own people and for the international community. We'll be happy to be open to more questions
Thank
later.
you, Brian. We do have 2 questions that we're going to deal with right now before we hear from Peter, because they're quick answers and it's not what Peter is going to talk about. Ian Campbell asks, what independent reporters were present, and were any reporters barred from viewing or listening to the proceedings? Anais, could you mute your screen for a second? Thank you. We don't have a list of all of the reporters that were present, but we were in contact with a great many who had been trying to gain access and were allowed to gain access. We'll know better today from when we see the stories that people wrote. There were a number of reporters present in the courtroom, and the American ambassador to the US ambassador to Rwanda, Peter Vrooman, insisted with the Rwandans that the proceedings be live streamed so that reporters who wanted to cover it could cover it, and so that there wouldn't be an overcrowding of the courtroom because of COVID situations. And then the other question was about the support that Belgian authorities have provided to their countrymen. And Corinne, if you could briefly talk about that and maybe talk about the medication.
Yes, so Belgium has been saying that it's been providing consular assistance since the beginning. Frankly, we think that they're hiding behind the veil of consular assistance because first off, their consular assistance has not been nearly effective at all. We sent medication through the Belgian diplomatic suitcase to Rwanda. Hence the Belgian state agreed to take medication to our father, who's a Belgian citizen, sitting in in prison. However, when they brought it to the prison authorities have refused to give our father his medication. He has high blood pressure. He has a hypertension. He needs that medication to survive. And so the fact that Belgium brought the medication but never ensured that he actually has it is showing that the consular assistance isn't doing anything. Additionally, Dad has been denied his rights to his chosen counsel. He's been denied his rights to his privileged documentation that are confiscated every time Maître Terragashavana goes to see him. And Belgium has not done anything about making sure that he keeps his document. So the assistance, the veil that I meant about the consular assistance that Belgium is giving is just to please the public. This is not being effective at all. And if anything, then it's time for Belgium to take a stand, as has the rest of Europe, as has the US, and protects its citizen and demand he returns home.
Thank you. There's a couple other questions, but first, and we will get to those. Don't panic. They're very important questions, but first I'd like to hear from Peter Koharis. And Peter can talk about some of the legal matters and also talk about what happened in Congress that's very exciting and that I think will move things forward.
Thanks very much, Kitty. So a couple of things. First, with respect to Congress, the Congress just released yesterday publicly a letter that had been written several weeks ago to the president of Rwanda, President Kagame, asking for an immediate release of Paul Rusesabagina on humanitarian grounds. It was only released recently because the Congress had been encouraging strongly the Rwandan government, and specifically the embassy in Washington, to work with the State Department and Paul's international counsel, myself, to try to arrange some kind of mechanism for a humanitarian release. As all of you, I think, are aware, Paul is suffering from several serious health conditions, pre-existing conditions. There's the question or issue of whether he's getting his blood pressure medications. What we do know is we don't believe that he is getting his actual medications, but what we do know is his blood pressure has been consistently extremely high. He's lost an enormous amount of weight in a short period of time. And of course, COVID is rampant in Kigali right now, but especially in the prison system. So he's in real danger. So we have asked for humanitarian release, and sadly, the official response from the Rwandan government did not come from the office of the president, did not come from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but came from the Ministry of Justice, where they simply backhanded the request from Congress and said that the justice system should take care of this. Well, the justice system doesn't take care of clemency, presidential pardon, or humanitarian release. That's up to the office of the president. Why is the congressional letter important? Well, it's coming from 37 leaders, and then another leading member of Congress sent her own letter that paralleled it, or paralleled the language of it, but 38 in total, every leader of the foreign policy committees in Congress, House and Senate, Republican and Democrat, signed the letter. So as anybody who has been at all remotely familiar with US politics over the last month or two, there has been a profound lack of bipartisan cooperation on all sorts of issues. But on this one, there was absolutely no disagreement. There was overwhelming support to bring Paul home immediately from both Republicans and Democrats, the leadership in the House and the Senate. So that, coupled with the the European Parliament resolution, shows you something, that far from having a show trial, to use Brian's term, which is showing or undermining Paul's credibility as a humanitarian, what this has done is galvanized international support for Paul and for his immediate release and for condemnation of the proceedings that they've subjected him to. So that's very important. One of the things that both the Europeans and the US Congress are quite concerned about are, as we've already discussed, the terms of Paul's capture or kidnapping, it's important to remember that under the US statute, there are two US statutes at play here. One is deportation. Very briefly, had the Rwandan government had evidence that comes anywhere close to meeting the criminal standard of for his guilt, they could have gone to the United States government and sought deportation proceedings. They have done that in the past, and others have done that in the past successfully. 8 Rwandans have been subjected to deportation proceedings. 4 have actually been sent from the United States, deported to Rwanda, and 4 more will after they complete their prison sentences in the United States. So this procedure works. It is available to the Rwandans. They know that it exists and that it works and it complies with due process of law. Why didn't they do that? Because the evidence simply isn't there. That's the only explanation one can offer. Secondly, there's the kidnapping statute. And people think or don't understand that kidnapping, you have to come with a gun and grab somebody and throw them in the trunk of a car and whisk them away. Not at all. There are 2 components that are relevant here. One is the term inveiglement or connivance. It's basically some kind of trickery. Why is that in the kidnapping statute? Because it's really even though it's an old statute, human trafficking. You can't trick people, especially at the time it was young women, to try to promise them something, bring them across state lines, and then, subject them to terrible conditions. And so even trickery, chicanery is a form of kidnapping. And of course, conspiracy to kidnap is also a felony under US law. And if you look at the public statements made by Rwandan officials in, I believe it was August, in an interview with the New York Times, by the security forces, and then again on September 6th by President Kagame, these are pretty much admissions that what took place was inveiglement in violation of the US statute. And certainly planning for it alone is enough for conspiracy to kidnap. So that's important. Now, with respect to the State Department, I think this State Department and Secretary Blinken is committed to trying to focus on this case and impress upon the Rwandans the importance of this case to the United States. And as Kitty mentioned, Ambassador Vrooman is attending the trial, I believe, in person. That's a big deal, that a US ambassador would be spending the entire day watching a trial. I would simply say that we're pleased by some of these developments, but urge the State Department to go even further. In the past, a couple of months ago, before the new State Department, there were 2 fundamental misunderstandings by some career people at the State Department. One, it wasn't clear whether he was kidnapped because they didn't understand the statute, because, he was tricked to go to Dubai, and then from Dubai, he was put on a plane. They didn't understand the conspiracy component and the inveiglement component of it, and that was unfortunate. The other was we have to abandon the notion in this country of, well, let's wait and see what happens in the trial. We heard that from the prior State Department, and we even saw it publicly in terms of tweets. That's very unfortunate because it indicates 2 things. One, a complete misunderstanding of how trials work. Trials just don't suddenly happen today. As Brian pointed out, there have been several pretrial violations of Paul's rights that a judge simply can't wave his gavel or wand and eliminate. The denial of access to counsel, the denial of access to international counsel, the confiscation of his papers, the lack of an arrest warrant, lack of even jurisdiction, which is fundamental and a fatal flaw, and the fact that you have multiple serious pretrial motions that haven't even been ruled upon. So this notion that, we'll wait and see if the trial is fair or not, it's already not fair. It already violates his due process rights. That's what the European Parliament resolution noted. And that's what the law stands for in terms of his international human rights. That's what the ABA noted in its recent report. And I'm encouraging our friends, and especially this new administration, to start to understand that, when we wait to see the results of a trial, all we're doing is encouraging or incentivizing governments to abduct Americans, which includes green card holders like Paul, have a show trial, and then maybe we'll deal with the fallout. And in Paul's case, it's it can be dangerous anywhere because often the prison conditions can be life-threatening, but it creates an adverse or perverse incentive, as economists would say, and that's not what we want to do as a result, as a focus of U.S. policy. The policy should be bring our people home now. And with that, I'll end and look forward to any questions.
Great. And if I may, Peter, you touched on the European Parliament. Corinne, could you just give us a brief overview about the European Parliament resolution? And then I noticed there's another question about Belgium and Rwanda, and we will answer that today. But I also wanted to preview that we'll be having another press conference later in the week, likely on Friday morning, Brussels time, to talk more in depth and to do a deeper dive on the issues between the Brussels justice system and the Rwandan justice system. But Corinne, if you want to go ahead and talk briefly about the European Parliament resolution, please.
Yes, so last week, for the very first time in history, the European Union, the European Parliament collectively condemned Paul Kagame and the Rwandan government for its abuses of human rights, and especially highlighting the case of my father, Paul Rusesabagina. They called out the Rwandan government, they condemned the Rwandan government for enforced disappearance, for torture, for holding him incommunicado for 3 days, and for depriving him of his basic human rights. And this is, again, the first time the European Union ever condemned Paul Kagame to this extent. And it's also telling of how the world is coming to terms with the reality on the ground in Rwanda. It asked as well for an independent investigation into the legality of the arrest of my father. They said that if they found that he wasn't arrested illegally, he must be released immediately and unconditionally. So this is, again, another condemnation of Rwanda and by their collective European Union. We hope that this will make Rwanda react.
Thank you so much, Corinne. And again, the next question, Brian, I'm going to have you touch on it, but I also want to highlight that later this week, we will have a press conference with Vincent Lorcan, who's one of our lawyers who's been working in Belgium and is embroiled in the intersection between the Rwandan justice system and the Belgian. So Brian, the question is, it's certainly important to understand if and to what extent Belgian and Rwandan justice have collaborated in the run-up to the arrest of Paul Rusesabagina.
Absolutely, and that's an excellent question. We are still finding this out. And this is an area of great concern for us, both for Paul's defense, but also for the Belgian government, we think, in how they have been dealing with Rwanda. What we've known all along is that the Belgian government assisted Rwanda in investigating Paul's house. The Belgian prosecutors, or Belgian authorities rather, with Rwanda Investigation Bureau personnel went into Paul's house in Belgium and they raided the house. All they took were a couple of electronic devices though, computer and a cell phone. And we know that those are now central to the Rwandan government's inquiry into Paul and prosecution of Paul. And we understand they're going to try to bring out some things from those devices. We have still not seen the specifics on these. We're now at trial and we have still not seen any proof that they have found anything. There's been no discovery on that at all, and we're looking for it. Beyond the trial, though, the concern is, why was Rwanda working, or why was Belgium rather, working with Rwanda on this? And what we understand are, in the background, there were a number of agreements, possibly justice agreements, possibly intelligence service agreements between Rwanda and Belgium. And it is possible that the Belgian government was helping the Rwandans to investigate Belgian citizens. This is an enormous concern because people in the government keep telling us it hasn't happened. And seems likely at this point that people in the Belgian government did not understand that it was happening and this was an extra governmental issue. We absolutely want to get to the bottom of this. We are talking to the Belgians about this. This is incredibly important for how Belgium treats his citizens, as well as being incredibly important for Paul Rusesabagina's case.
And again, we will be delving more into that later on this week. Brian, there's another question that's come up from Ian Campbell. Sources have said that terrorist organization, quote unquote terrorist organization he's linked to, did not commit murders and that the RPF committed them. Will Paul's defense be putting evidence forward on this point?
Thank you, and that's an excellent question, and thank you for following what's been happening that closely. This is something incredibly important that is going on in the background of this case. Just to put a little bit more flesh on the question, person after person that we talk to, Rwandans who are in the diaspora, exiles, people who have worked with Kagame's government in the past, people who are part of the MRCD and FLN leaderships. Those are the parties involved. Rwandan Movement for Democratic Change is the party Paul was an officer of. They have been providing us with information over the past 5 months. And the picture that we are building casts doubt on whether these attacks actually existed. We are looking for evidence that they did, and we are not finding it. That could be because the Rwandan government hasn't provided it yet. But we do know that the only evidence out there was given by government spokespeople and also by the Rwandan press, which is completely beholden to the Rwandan government. We don't have the facts on this yet. We want to strongly encourage the press corps and the international community to delve into this more deeply and to find out the facts. What we do know is that since 1994 to the present day, there are continual allegations of the Rwandan military and Rwandan intelligence creating false flag operations, attacking their own citizens inside of Rwanda, and blaming it on other groups. And we have heard significant behind the scenes comments that this is the case with these 3 current attacks of which Paul and his co-defendants are accused. We're not even positive that the attacks existed. We're strongly encouraging the international community to look into them. Problematically, we don't think we're going to be able to bring this up at trial. And the reason is, if our lawyer brought this up at trial, he would probably be accused of treason against the Rwandan government for the act of bringing it up. This is something that is not the kind of thing that you are allowed to bring up inside of a Rwandan courtroom. We can talk about it here. We certainly want to talk about it here, but we don't expect that we'll be able to bring this up at trial.
Brian, I just want to emphasize one other thing, and it may never get brought up in trial, but we can bring it up here in the court of public opinion. After these attacks allegedly happened, allegedly by the FLN, Paul Rusesabagina called for a United Nations investigation of the attacks. If he had perpetrated the attacks, or if he was associated with anyone who had perpetrated the attacks, why would he have called for a United Nations investigation? And why did Paul Kagame block an United Nations investigation? There's one other, Brian, I think a quick question about the latest in the case regarding GameJet. And then we've got a more complicated question after that. But if you want to quickly, what's the latest on GameJet?
Great, thank you. Latest on GameJet, we have not had any movement with the case so far. We are trying to serve the appropriate parties. Those are GameJet and the gentleman known as the Bishop, who we now have very specific knowledge lured Paul to Rwanda. The knowledge is his own written testimony to the Rwandan government. One of the documents that we received in the 5,000 documents, we haven't had time to go through all of them yet, but one of those documents is a statement from the bishop that he gave after he got off the plane in Rwanda. And that statement is perfectly clear that he was brought in by the Rwandan government to lure Paul Rusesabagina to Rwanda. His story is that he was questioned by them and asked to lure him in to get Paul from the United States to Dubai to Rwanda, that he distracted Paul while Paul was on the plane so Paul could not know that they were going to Kigali, that he made all of the arrangements for the flights and brought them through security for the flights. And then he flew with Paul to Rwanda. Bishop is one of the co-defendants in that GameJet case. All of this goes to what Peter was mentioning earlier, which was this is plain and simple by international definitions, US definitions, Belgian definitions, and Rwandan definitions, a kidnapping. We have one of the kidnappers who in court documents has effectively said, yes, he did it. The significant question for us that we would once again love for the press to help us out with and that we are investigating ourselves is who paid for the plane. We believe the plane was paid for by the Rwandan government, and we are looking for documented proof of that. We have a number of suggestions. It has been. We simply need to finalize that question of whether it was paid for by the Rwandan government. We think that's still an incredibly important thing to investigate.
I think the last question that we have for right now, and if other people have questions, please put them in the question and answer form. But the last question that we have is, as we noted at the beginning of our press conference, there is aggression in Rwanda by the police against people. There's more and more human rights violations. The Rwandan police going after the young poet Bahati, what's going on with Ivan. There's been a number of deaths in police custody. And I don't know, Anais, if you want to talk about this or one of the attorneys wants to talk about the increase in the number of human rights violations recently in Rwanda and the police aggression.
Sure, I can take a stab and then I'll let the others also talk about it. But something that's been reported on in Rwanda that's been clear in COVID during the pandemic is that over the last couple of months, the intense kind of securitization of the country in the name of COVID. A lot of people today, are going to jail for no reason, are disappearing for no reason. And that's because the government today is taking advantage of COVID and the measure that they've taken today to go beyond and do political motivated disappearance. And so, for instance, today in Rwanda, you need to be back home. Curfew is at 6 p.m. If you're not in your home at 6 p.m., you can be taken to the stadium. And during these hours of the day, that's when a lot of people disappear until the next morning. And they disappear because they've been dissident or just because they are not happy with the government and they've been vocal. And so this is what's happening in Rwanda today. Today, the people of Rwanda are suffering. We've seen it with Ivan, we've heard it, we watched it, and we started going to jail. This is the kind of government that doesn't care about what's happening, that doesn't care about the press, doesn't care about they just want to do what they want. And the people of Rwanda are suffering. And so, the context really is just to put this COVID-19 has, just like we've seen here in the United States or all over the world where COVID-19 is exposing some of the things that countries don't like to talk about and these challenges that countries are struggling. COVID-19 has really, really shown all these things that President Kagame has been trying to cover up for the last years. I'll let Brian move in. Peter actually says something else on this.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, I just wanted to point out the Freedom House report that was just issued entitled Out of Sight, Not Out of Reach, the Global Scale and Scope of Transnational Repression. It included case studies of, I think, 5 or 6 countries, one of them Rwanda, and I'll just read the opening sentence. from the report. Rwandan transnational repression is exceptionally broad in terms of tactics, targets, and geographic reach. The next sentence. Rwandans abroad experience digital threats, spyware attacks, family intimidation and harassment, mobility controls, physical intimidation, assault, detention, rendition, and assassination. And it goes on to say that the government has physically targeted Rwandans in at least 7 countries, and Rwandans as far flung as the United States, Canada, and Australia report intense fears of surveillance and retribution. So if that can happen in countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia, one can imagine what is happening in Rwanda itself.
And I want to just make a brief comment about that Freedom House report. What's interesting is now Rwanda is increasingly using electronic surveillance means, but they have been surveilling and harassing Paul Rusesabagina with physical human assets for years. We have documentation from the Rwandans themselves talking about their plans of tracking and surveilling Paul Rusesabagina. For several years, it was Ambassador Kamonyo, the Rwandan ambassador to the United States, who did it personally on several occasions. Additionally, we recently found out that the Rwandan government, and we found this out through transparent United States government records, the FARA registrations, that Rwanda had an American woman on payroll for at least 3 years spying on Paul and Paul's foundation. And Corinne, I know you wanted to speak next.
Yeah, I think as I'd like to just add on what you guys all said in regards to all the violations that Peter just mentioned. Not only are they inhumane, but they're also, as the European Union clearly stated it, that they are a complete disregard of the treaties that Rwanda has signed with these and all these other nations. They have signed treaty committing to respecting human rights, committing to due process and to justice, and all of these violations of taking people across border against their will and against legal, without following established legal procedure, are violations of these treaties that Rwanda has signed. So what the answers, what are the questions we should be asking now is, what are those nations going to do to hold Rwanda accountable? What is the next step? Perhaps sanctions, economic sanctions is the next step. But I believe all of these are clear disregard of international law and is showing that Rwanda can do whatever it wants, and it needs to be stopped before they continue before it gets worse.
Corinne, do you feel comfortable talking about the harassment, the electronic harassment that you've undergone?
Yes, I've been receiving messages from the person who supposedly calls himself one of Dad's prison guards. He started off by saying that Dad had given him my number, but Dad does not have my new number. And so I knew off the bat that this was strange. He said a lot of things that we knew to be true regarding his current conditions of detainment, but also and his health and things that he had told us. And so it sounded like it was somebody who's in and who has all this information and who had access to my number. What he was saying is that he wanted to help my father escape. He was very persistent, even harassment, calling me multiple times a day, insisting that I respond, insisting that I write anything. And what we know is that the Rwandan government has used these methods in the past to further incriminate prisoners or to assassinate them, and under the guise of a escape attempt, by saying that these people were trying to escape. They would show messages that I received from this man and said, look, this man is plotting to escape with his daughter. That is not true. I never responded to any of those messages. In fact, I reported them to the Belgian authorities and to the American authorities for them to investigate it as well. But we just know that this is a method that they use, and it's very inhumane considering that the condition that our family is in and the worries we have for our father. We will get our father out of that prison legally, not through these methods. And so if they try to get to incriminate him further by lying that he's trying to escape, or to kill him by, like they killed Kizito by lying that he was escaping, we will not stand for that. And we made it very clear that we made it public, and we reported it so that it doesn't happen. And since we reported it, those messages stopped. So I assume they got the message that we will not stand for it.
May I go, Kitty?
Something?
I would just observe two things. First, that different branches of the United States government on their own, without any prompting on my part or our part, have begun talking about what kind of sanctions might be appropriate with respect to the Rwandan government. And that brings up the second point, which is, I would urge the government to start now engaging in good faith discussions with us to talk about how we get Paul out safely. I think if something happens to him under any circumstances, even if it were COVID related, people are going to hold this government accountable. The parallel I've made in private, and I'll make it publicly, is I feel like this government grossly overcalculated, just like the Saudis grossly overcalculated in terms of the impact of Khashoggi. They just didn't understand ahead of time what a terrible decision and what a terrible path they followed. And the impact has been a disaster for them internationally and in the United States. And it hasn't gone away, not after a year, and we're coming up on 2 years. And I would just urge the Rwandan government to really think hard about how we bring Paul home as a humanitarian gesture or otherwise, and work with us on that, because I think that's the way we avoid a tragedy here, not only for Paul and his family, but also for the Rwandan government and the Rwandan people in terms of what might happen as things go forward.
Thank you very much. We have another question about COVID-19, and is there any sense in having the Commonwealth Summit in Kigali, given the world pandemic and a stop on flights in and out of the country? Well, we have some thoughts on the Commonwealth Summit. We don't think that they should have it for many reasons, including COVID, but one of our advocacy actions in the next few weeks is going to be putting pressure, public pressure, through the media, through social media, through our friends and allies, talking to the Commonwealth heads of government that are based obviously in Britain, the head of the Commonwealth. We're going to be targeting them with social media and media pressure to say, not only should you not have the Commonwealth head of government meeting in Rwanda because of COVID, but you shouldn't have it there because they are violating human rights left and right. Look at what they did to Paul Rusesabagina. Look at what they did to Kizito. Look at what they did to Ivan. Where is innocent Bahati? So we are going to be pressuring, we're going to be using the Commonwealth head of government meeting as a major pressure point in our advocacy work. And Brian, do you want to take, I think you can see the next two questions, maybe read them and go ahead and address them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kitty. From Celestine, and I'll put these two questions together, and I think the follow-up one is excellent. When Kagame was still appearing publicly to the media, he declared that it had been reported to him the operation of Rusesabagina's kidnapping had been conducted smoothly, quote unquote, with not even a hint of a hitch. I'll insert here, by the way, he used the word flawlessly. Kagame used the word flawlessly. Is that enough evidence that the entire operation was a Rwandan government operation, including the employment of the bishop? And your previous question too was more details on the bishop. We absolutely think it was. This was a statement that you are referring to that President Kagame made several days after Paul surfaced in Rwanda. President Kagame had a press conference. The press conference was in English, which means he was speaking to the international community, not just to his own people. And during this press conference, President Kagame did two things. The first thing he did was effectively admit to the kidnapping. He said that it was an operation to lure Paul to Rwanda, to bring him there voluntarily without his knowledge, and then it worked flawlessly and he was arrested. The problem, as Peter has told us in detail, is there is no such thing as luring someone voluntarily into this situation. That is still kidnapping, no matter what polite words you use to cover up the idea. President Paul Kagame of Rwanda has already admitted to this kidnapping. The second point is in that exact same speech, President Paul Kagame stated that Paul Rusesabagina is guilty of terrorism. To be clear, in legal terms, this is the president of a country, and not just the president, but a dictator who holds complete sway over the judicial system, the judges, the prosecutors, the Bar Association, prejudging the guilt of an accused person. There is absolutely no way that there can be a fair trial based on this. As mentioned from the questioner, this is absolutely sufficient evidence in any court in the world, except in Rwanda, to have this case thrown out. It is not, unfortunately, enough evidence in Rwanda. And sadly, as I mentioned before, with some of the other evidence, one of the problems with the Rwandan system is Rwandan lawyers are not comfortable bringing up certain pieces of evidence in court. And even if it were brought up in court, the suggestion that President Paul Kagame did something negative is treason inside of Rwanda. And you can be prosecuted for that, whether you are the defendant, it could be added to your charges, or whether you are a lawyer, you can find yourself in jail for suggesting that the president did something wrong. So while we believe this is damning evidence in this case for kidnapping and for the fact that Paul was brought there against his will, we believe it should stop the trial. We do not realistically expect that it will. This is another reason the international community has to step in. There are no fair trials in Rwanda.
The last question that we have right now is about the UAE and what happened with the UAE. Was there cooperation? And maybe you can address the letter that the UAE sent to the United Nations.
Absolutely. The UAE now is completely public with their activities. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture began a process that brought in several other United Nations groups. We're also finishing up a report to the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, among others. And the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights took up the case of Paul's kidnapping and Paul's treatment since he was brought to Rwanda. They filed a long report that we have made public on our website. Perhaps we can put that in the chat. I think most people have it. The UN Special Rapporteur filed a very public report. The report was sent to Rwanda and to the UAE. And as they were sent there, Rwanda has not yet responded in any significant way. The UAE did respond. And the UAE's response was clear. They were not involved with the Rwandan government in any way. They deny any involvement of this. There was no international cooperation, even though the Rwandan government says that international cooperation exists. And the Rwandan government has continually talked about an arrest warrant for Paul. This actually isn't new. This isn't new since 2018. They talked about this in 2010 also, and they have never produced an arrest warrant. No one has seen them. There is no Interpol notice on Paul. And the UAE flatly said in a public legal statement that they had not received any arrest warrant or any notification of illegal activities. It simply isn't there. The Rwandan government, from the UAE's perspective, has made up that story.
Thank you, Brian. We have no further questions at this point. Did anyone want to make any sort of closing remark for us? Seeing none, or Anais, is that you? Unmute, and why don't you close us out for today?
Yes, I just wanted to thank everyone for just being with us today, and for everybody who from across the United States here stayed up at night to watch the trial, and people who just wanting my father to be back. You know, it's with, again, your support, the support of the media, independent media, that to share the story to what my father's of my father. So we thank you a lot for being here with us, and we ask you to continue to stay with us until we bring my father back home. Thank you. And also, don't forget Kizito Mihigo. Today is his day.
Thank you all so much for your advocacy, your reporting. Facts matter, truth matters. We are here to bring you answers and to bring the truth. And because we know that that likely won't come out during Paul's trial. So we're going to be here throughout the trial to bring you the truth and to bring you facts. Thank you so much for joining us today.